Join me today as we review the book Abundance by Ezra Klein and Thompson. This is the Geek Cabal channel. If you've not been here before, my name is Bobbie, and today we're going to be talking about the book Abundance by Ezra Klein and Thompson. So, this is a non-fiction book. I know most of the books I review are Battletech books. This is non-fiction. I do read non-fiction books. And I'm going to give a warning here up front. There is absolutely no way to talk about this book without going into politics. There are politics heavily influences the book. So I cannot do so without engaging in some type of political conversations here. I will do what I can to avoid being partisan, but I have to talk about politics to talk about this book. So, with that in mind, I did like the book. Thought it was good. Thought it was interesting. I have a few critiques, mainly from not so much a content standpoint, but from a "you're really going to do that, huh?" kind of standpoint. It's just a few little things here and there, but since one of the things the book does is something it criticizes other people of doing, I feel that needs to be mentioned. Anyway, this book, Ezra Klein is an author for the New York Times, unless I'm mistaken. Not to just say that everyone at the New York Times is liberal, but he is of the liberal persuasion. He's a Democrat. And so the book is basically him trying to tell other people in the Democrat Party, hey, we may want to rethink some things. And he opens with explaining that, just like the Republicans, he wishes he could be like, hey, look over here, here's where we have governed, and this is why you should like these things. And he talks about California. And he's like, we should be able to point to that and say, hey, this is the shining city on the hill. Like, don't you all want to live under this type of governance? And to make the case to vote Democrat. As he points out, that is not the reality that we live in, because California has considerable problems. There's obviously upsides, and it's a beautiful state, and I'm sure that a lot of the people in government, just as in most state governments and for both parties, genuinely want to actually help. The high-level people, governors and senators and presidents and whatnot, maybe at one point they thought that way, and maybe a handful of them still do. But it looks like most of them are just in it for enrichment or to make themselves famous or who the hell knows what. But like the actual people that, do the day-to-day things, I think a lot of them actually do want to help. Maybe I'm naive. But anyway, and so he points to California's assorted problems, and he concedes that they are problems. And he's like, we can't, this is him speaking, saying we can't blame this on Republicans in any way because we control every single elected position in the state, have a supermajority in the Senate. Like, if they wanted to do something, they could do it. Or if they wanted to reverse something, they could do it. So whatever has happened on their watch. And then he's like, hey, that's on us. So it's nice to see a book that is able to be introspective like that. I would love to see a book like this from the Republicans as well. Trying to be like, hey, some things have worked and some things haven't. Maybe we should reconsider. So most of the book focuses on things, how the government should work, and gives examples of how it has worked well in the past. And a lot of the big examples boil down to someone somewhere was able to say, we're going to ignore all these regulations. This has to be done. And his primary argument seems to be that these regulations are getting in the way and that there need to be other things need to be considered. Now, this is one of those moments of, personally, I think there might have been a better way to go about this. because as a Democrat, he does take digs at the Republicans. I expect that, and if it were a Republican book, I'd expect the other as well. But when you're sitting there saying that regulations are getting in the way, and in the same breath criticizing Republicans for cutting regulations, I'm not 100% certain what you're actually trying to say, because it seems like you're acknowledging that the regulations largely put forth by your own party are getting in the way, and the other party wants to get rid of them, which you acknowledge is how these things are done, these big projects, how they get done, but you don't want to actually even remotely credit those people for putting forth that idea. And instead you keep an adversarial mindset instead of, hey, maybe, just maybe, we could talk to the Republicans, win a few of them over who want to cut regulations, and just figure out which regulations should be cut, instead of just letting them run on cutting regulations, eventually get elected, and then just cut whatever the hell they feel like. Like, I feel like there's a middle ground here. And the fact this solution isn't even proposed, isn't even spoke of, I think that's a problem. And hey, maybe it's been attempted in the past, and the Republicans are just unreasonable about it. But that was never brought up, which leads me to believe that there's no credible proof that has happened. Because again, he doesn't have any problem taking digs at Republicans or his own side. Again, he admits that these are problems of the political left in the U.S. So he's got various examples talking about housing authorities and just all kinds of layers of regulation that make it near impossible to build houses in some places. And they've given too many people veto power, essentially. But he also acknowledges that finding the middle ground, because you also don't want to just have no zoning where they can just build a factory next to you or something. Like, there have to be some rules, but we probably have too many. And they're written with people in mind who have moneyed interests, like the housing problem. I read a book and did a video on it called Strong Towns, which is a very good companion piece to this if you want to get a more complete picture of the situation here in the United States. One of the big problems is it's very difficult to build multifamily structures, apartment buildings, in other words, or even duplexes or triplexes. Unfortunately, I'm not an English major. I don't know what you call the other complexes, but in a lot of cities, it's basically impossible to build those. Or it's possible, but like a local housing authority, like, yeah, no, we voted on it. We said no, so you can't do it. And developers just stop at a certain point. Like, there's no point in trying. We'll just go build houses out in suburbia, and then BlackRock buys all of them. So that's another problem that's not even mentioned in here, but it is a problem. So you have this problem, but if you look at New York, for instance, New York was not built with that kind of mindset. New York has very tall buildings and has a hell of a lot of people. That's why, there's tens of millions of people living in New York in a fairly small area, but it's also one of the richest cities in the country, because it was built back before we started adding these absurd rules. And again, if you read Strong Towns, it goes into this a lot, how these larger buildings like this are major economic centers versus single level whatever. It's just not. The tax base isn't there or anything. And so our cities need to be going up, not out. He doesn't quite get to that in here, but he does mention that obviously the way we currently do housing is a problem. And he compares California to, I believe it's Texas. And he points out there's no problem in Texas because Texas has far fewer regulations. They just let people build buildings. There's some zoning, obviously, but because again, with the toxic waste plant right next to you, but they just go. And I don't think he's 100% for just complete openness, but definitely way more towards that end. I happen to agree. But yeah, and then he talks about things like renewable energy versus fossil fuels and how we should be building more solar, and I agree on that, but I think there are better ways to go about doing it than the ways we do it. Like, for instance, I saw a thing one day is a picture of a car lot, not a car lot, a parking lot, like for an airport or something. And it's like, well, you have this giant area that you've already paved over. why don't you build posts with the solar panels over the parking spots? So one, the cars will be cooler when people come and get into them. They won't be incinerating on the inside. But also, you don't have to then pave over, farmland somewhere. And it's little things like that. In and of themselves might not be the whole solution, but they would definitely be far more practical, and we'd lose less farmland and wilderness because like solar fields take up a lot of space. And it's okay to build them in the desert because there's hardly anything there. But I'm given to understand that there's that whole sand at high speeds doesn't do any favors to glass and reflective surfaces kind of thing. Plus, no one lives in the desert, so the electricity has to be pushed along much longer lines to get anywhere useful. So I do agree with him though that we need to do solar. But the core concept of the book is that the government is basically broken in that we in the United States, we create all kinds of new technologies, and then nothing happens here with them. We let some other country take off and run with it. And, the big example is like solar power or microchips, both of which developed here in the United States, neither of which are made in the United States in any real numbers. Taiwan is where most of the microchips are made. China is where most of the solar panels are made. And there is absolutely no reason for that. And he talks about bottlenecks, and what we really need is a division of the government basically to find the bottlenecks in where these things are stopping and to fix them. And he mentioned one of his examples was the development of penicillin. And he talks about how we're stuck on this. We're stuck in the idea of science as these eureka moments, and then things just kind of happen. And he's like, no, that's not really how it works. He's talking about penicillin. There was the eureka moment of, hey, penicillin destroys bacterial infections. But it took decades to get to the, okay, but how do we use that? How do we turn that into a medicine? And the Europeans couldn't figure it out, and then they were in the middle of a world war. But we, the United States, had just recently developed one of the not a division within the government. It'll come to me here in a second, the official term, but essentially not a branch because there's only 3 branches. Department within the government to deal with scientific advancement, and it's mainly for the war. But they saw the very obvious application of, well, if we can prevent soldiers from dying from infections, this will be important. So they figured out how to build it at scale, how to build facilities, how to create this new drug, penicillin, at scale, and how to get hundreds of millions of doses to people, the distribution center. They figured all these problems out, and they did it. And so he talks about how we had that problem. We were faced with that problem with the coronavirus, COVID, because the mRNA technology existed for quite a while, but no one was interested in it. And they had a tangent on how departments like the NIH need to be reformed because we're getting to the point where we're only backing science that we know is going to succeed, and we really need to be looking more into taking some chances. But the problem is, at the moment, you've got to spend half your time filling out paperwork. You've got to show you're meeting with success, with goals. And that was all well-intentioned. And I agree with the intentions because you don't want to just be pissing money away. But at the same time, a lot of science happens out at the weird frontier, and we're having, we're after the low-hanging fruit when we need to be looking a little bit farther up the tree. So we're playing it safe when at least a portion of what we're doling out should be going to wild things, science for the sake of science. Because even if it doesn't pan out for whatever we're trying to figure out, the knowledge we gain from it could potentially fuel something else down the road. Because every little bit of knowledge gained does ultimately bring us closer to other advancements. And you could argue, and people of a more libertarian bent do, that the government shouldn't even be involved in these things. Mr. Klein argues that, yeah, they should, because a lot of these things are too big for corporations to handle, especially since we don't allow monopolies. And we don't allow, because he talked about Bell Labs, how they created all kinds of things because they had a monopoly. They didn't have to worry about certain aspects of the profit motive. They were allowed to just do science for science sake over the course of decades and create all kinds of inventions as a result. Now, he wasn't arguing for allowing monopolies. He was just saying that, like, it's very difficult to recreate that in today's environment where we don't allow monopolies, and we shouldn't allow monopolies. But their government counterparts were created for a certain time in a certain place under certain circumstances, and maybe things like the NIH either need serious reform or no longer serve their purpose, and we need something else. And he mentions DARPA quite a bit. That's for those who don't know what DARPA is, or I should say, the NIH is National Institute of Health. They put money out there for experiments, things like that, try to advance medicine, essentially. So, DARPA is a part of the Defense Department that doles out money for technologies that they feel 20 years from now, 30 years from now, are going to be important to our military and to the government. And so they need to see these technologies, they need to see them progress, to evolve, to mature. And to do that, they provide initial capital to help these things along, help them come into being. They're the ones who created the internet. It was originally called the ARPANET, if I remember correctly, which eventually became the DARPANET, and then eventually the internet. And it initially started as a desire to have a communication system that could withstand a nuclear attack. And from that, everything else emerged. So they do very important work, and they get tremendous bang for their buck because of how they're set up. Because they essentially just have groups of people that are like, here's money, we trust you, do something with it. Like, there's very little oversight, there's probably a lot of failures, but the successes are far more important than any of the failures and outweigh any loss of money. So he argues that a group like the NIH needs to be willing to take risks, maybe needs to be more hands-off, or maybe even it's a system where each of the people that are on these boards is given, he referred to as a golden ticket. Like, you pick one project that we're not going to fund, that the rest of us think are ridiculous, but you see promise in it, and they get funded. Maybe it's they get funded, maybe it's they have less strict reporting guidelines, they're not going to get blacklisted if it fails, things like that. In other words, we need to be willing to take more risks. We need to accept that we can't micromanage these things like we would like to, and it comes back to thinking that they're wasting taxpayer money, because there are things that do sound an awful lot like wasting taxpayer money. Rand Paul every year reads off a list of some of the gobbledygook that gets funded, and yeah, some of it sounds like a total waste to me too. Now, like for instance, I think Sarah was telling me about, I think it was an experiment involving bringing spiders into zero gravity, and I think at some point it involved giving them cocaine or something, and that might be conflating two different experiments, but it was one of those like, I'm not a scientist, but I have to wonder, what is the hoped for goal of this experiment? What are we hoping to learn from this? What is the genesis of this idea? I'm not saying immediately, cut the funding, that sounds stupid. But I am saying I would need one hell of a justification for that, because one, that sounds expensive, and two, I can't even fathom what you're hoping to learn from that. So, explain it to me. And if I were like in Congress or here, I'd explain these things too. And it sounds like there's at least a worthwhile, hypothesis we have to test, okay. If it doesn't pan out, again, a lot of science doesn't. But we might learn something along the way. But there has to be a realistic chance of learning something. Now that chance doesn't have to be high, because again, part of the problem is, we're sticking with things that sound like we're 2 steps away from solving them. We need to be focusing on problems that we don't have any earthly idea of how to solve, and we need to begin that process. The other, that'll find a solution. It's right there. But anyway, I talked about that. Talked about push funding versus pull funding. Push funding being, hey, here's money, make this work. Pull funding being, if you make this work, we'll give you money. And the pull funding, in my opinion, seems to be the one that harnesses the capitalist system more. And we should do it a little bit more, because if a company sees there's a profit motive, they'll put resources behind it. They'll have the efficiency that a corporation usually has versus the government, and so on and so on. And they talked about that with the COVID vaccine, because part of it was, if you make the vaccine and we figure these things out, we're going to buy a certain number of doses from you. You will see X amount of dollars from us. So, that made it so that something normally takes several years was done in less than a year. And That's a hell of an accomplishment. Which does bring up one point in the book that I have to mention here. Okay, and this isn't praise for any people involved or condemnation for anyone, and I'm not going to wade into any of the outside stuff with the vaccine or anything. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm just going to explain something in the book. He mentions that it's got quite a bit about the vaccine and about Operation Warp Speed, and it's very far into that before he mentions by the way, this all happened under Donald Trump's first term as president. And it only comes up whenever he mentions that under Joe Biden's term, they very quickly renamed it and then tried to kind of stop talking about it. As to not to give Donald Trump any credit because it appeared toxic at the time. And it's funny because he literally just got done doing that same thing with his own words over the course of several pages. So that's one of those that's kind of odd that you're calling him out when you're doing the same thing. Because I get it, again, it's a Democrat, and he doesn't want to praise a Republican for something when he's trying to use it as an example of how to do things, especially one that worked, and wants to, as much as possible, not be like, oh, by the way, it was the Republicans that did this, not us guys. I get it, but in terms of intellectual honesty, that's a low move. But that shouldn't detract from the book itself. The points he makes are generally good points, and I think that, like I said towards the beginning, the obvious solution to me is get Republicans on board. Well, first you gotta get Democrats on board with the idea, and he talks at length that yes, this is definitely going to require some introspection because this is the system they built, and to now be like, maybe we need to start taking it apart because this is a different world. Yes, we had good intentions, but have they panned out? It even specifies we need to question that. And it talks about we're probably in the middle of a paradigm shift in politics. It talks about the two previous paradigms, one under the New Deal up through, which would be in the 40s, late 30s, early 40s, up through the 70s, when it all kind of imploded, which then led to the 80s of the neoliberal order, which appears to be petering out right about now. And so now it's a question of what's going to take its place. And he talks about, what it's going to have to come together and whatnot. And he doesn't spell it out, but obviously a concern of his is if that's happening, he obviously would prefer that the Democrat position becomes the new norm. And he's afraid that because of Democrat failings that he outlines here in the book, and the Republicans at least are paying lip service to what he views as the solution, that they're going to be the ones who define the era. Because he talked about the previous two, under the New Deal era. So, he talks about how Eisenhower comes in, he's a Republican, but he talks about everything, he accepts the terms of the New Deal era and tries to build on them. He accepts that that's the way of the road and doesn't try to turn things around or turn things back. He's like, no, this is the way things are, so we're going to do them this way. And then you had kind of the opposite with Reagan coming in, and you had Clinton then following as the first Democrat after Reagan. Basically literally saying, the era of big government is over. So he knows that even if this is a true paradigm shift, and let's say it's under Trump and a theoretical Vance if he's the candidate under his term, because it takes a while to set things in stone. That even if a Democrat wins immediately after that, they're going to largely play within the rules established here and try to advance things their way, but not try to actually adjust course. And, as a Democrat, obviously he doesn't want to see that. So that's one reason I'm sure why he's proposing, hey guys, if we want to stand any chance of controlling the narrative for the next couple of decades, we got to look in the mirror because the things we believed aren't working anymore if they ever did. And so it's going to be, it's going to be some harsh medicine we're going to have to swallow here, but the world has changed for better or worse. And at the end, he talks about how you can't let your party be defined as just being the opposite of the other party. And both parties definitely fall into this trap. And so it just leads you down nonsense, where you have to be where if the Republicans actually, if you're a Democrat and the Republicans actually do something constructive, you can't just be because they're saying it's good, you can't just say it's bad. And, the Republicans, Can't be like, oh, the Democrats are for this, so we have to be against this. That's nonsense. You have to be able to acknowledge when something actually works and build on it. Even if that means you got to swallow your pride and admit that the other side was the one that came up with the idea and implemented it. Because otherwise, we may as well just close up shop. Like that's a dead end. That ideology will eventually die. Just a matter of if it's going to take the rest of us down with it. So, no. But anyway, I think the author raises a lot of good points. As much as I am not a fan of the government intervening in a bunch of things, because I think it oversteps its bounds all the time. But I think it's also done so almost since the founding. So, but no, I think that there are problems that are too big for private industry to just handle, or there are things that are too important to hope that private industry decides to handle. In those moments, that's where the government has to do their thing, and it should do it as efficiently as possible. Tons of regulations, which again they come from a common sense desire to not waste money and time. But if you're wasting time and money implementing the regulations that you don't need to implement, then you're right back to square one. Maybe you're not wasting as much money, but you're probably wasting more time, and you're breeding inefficiency, and it's just not good. So like a serious looking at it, and even proposes that maybe we need to actually like run an experiment on how to run experiments, as in like we apparently don't know what the best way to use government power and funds are, so let's try a bunch of different ways over a decade or two, collect the data, see what worked, and go with that going forward. And I'm not opposed to that. Again, while I personally don't like tremendous government interference in things, I have to accept the real world that every other country does that, and that we do that too. We may as well just do it more efficiently, more open, and more with a more clear goal in mind. And those goals should be to advance our scientific knowledge, to increase the inventions that we create, and then to have the means to actually implement them here in the United States, to not have to just constantly offshore things. I mean, we have the technology now that we should be basically living in the future. I mean, we are. I'm recording this onto a phone that I'm going to put on the internet that the entire world can see. That was inconceivable to me living back in the 80s whenever I was born. So yes, obviously the world has changed, and in the first world countries we are basically living in the future. But it could be even more advanced. It's just that we, the country that makes these advancements, don't implement them here. We don't properly take advantage of them. And that's a problem, But like I said, overall, his point is that the reason it's called abundance, it has to do with the way we think about things. We think about things in terms of scarcity, which I disagree with him that we need to stop doing that, because things are scarce. It's just that they're maybe not as scarce as we make them out to be. We should still deal with things in terms of scarcity, because that's, capitalism is all about how to most efficiently allocate things by taking feedback in the form of markets and then adjusting accordingly. And the concept there is sound, take feedback, adjust accordingly. And so I'm opposed to dumping that. And he never embraces socialism. Yes, there's talk about Karl Marx at the end, but he even says, like, you don't have to be a communist to realize what he's saying here is probably accurate. And as I've said before, I don't like what the solutions socialism and communism propose, but some of their critiques are on point. So I did kind of roll my eyes when he got to the Karl Marx quote, I'm not going to lie. Like, I was expecting something like that throughout the entire book, and it's in the last couple of pages. It's a comment about how in capitalism there reaches a point where it can reach a point where further development is disadvantageous to the people in power, the moneyed interests. And he was like, why we shouldn't allow that, like we should full speed ahead. And I agree with the sentiment, probably not the solution that Marx proposed or Engels or whoever, but the sentiment is there because, for capitalism to work, you have to allow creative destruction. You have to allow people to build the better mousetrap and accept the results of what's going to fall, accept the fallout of that decision. Which means that, yeah, there is chaos in the markets because new things are constantly coming on the market. There are improvements constantly being made. And so as a consumer, we benefit. The people with the money, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. There's actual risks involved. And that's the way it's supposed to be. Not a perpetual, well, we're just going to be a multi-billion-dollar company from now to the end of eternity. Like, no, capitalism doesn't promise that. Like, just, in fact, quite the opposite. And that's actually kind of a microcosm. This isn't in the book, this is my opinion here. It's kind of a microcosm of part of the problem. Because as a company grows larger, it eventually develops its own like internal bureaucracy and its own internal ways of doing things that eventually start slowing things down. They start making the company less efficient, which allows for a smaller company to come along that can do things more efficiently and eat their lunch. And so that's kind of where things are, in my opinion, with the government. It's existed for over 200 years, and it's solidifying. It's becoming bigger, which means it has its own internal processes that are slowing things down, that are causing things to grind to a halt. There's too many people that have the power to slow things down. Now, I know in theory parts of our government were actually made with that intention because the founders believed they had a pretty good system and didn't want future generations to be able to screw it up. So change had to be slow. Get that? Largely agree with it. But there are moments where you have to move fast. And so building more things into it to make it move slower, that's not good. So we need to be able to take a look at things. Departments, just because they've existed for a while doesn't mean they have to keep existing. Doesn't mean they have to keep doing the same thing. Doesn't mean they have to keep doing it the same way. And like the perfect example they had here was updating, I think it's the IRS computers, because it's just this ongoing nightmare because they're written in COBOL and just all these other things where you can't just build a new system and just dump all the data into it. And you've got to be able to go back through the old data and figure out what's bad, what's been written for why, how they just continue to just patch the problem instead of fixing problems. And it's just a nightmare. And from what I know from computer science, yeah, it sounds pretty accurate to me. And so it looks like the update updates were supposed to be done, I don't know, decades ago, might be done a couple decades from now. There is no excuse for that. That's because we just put the problem off. And for COBOL, I mean, it's probably since the 70s. And yeah, it's just, there's just no excuse for that. And if it were, I'm not saying we should privatize the IRS here, but if it were a private institution, it never would have been allowed to get to that point. There would have been a moment where they'd been like, look, it's costing us this to do this. It's going to cost us this to fix it. And then we'll start saving this. The numbers say, change it now. We're going to change it now. Spend whatever it takes to make this happen. Do it as quickly as possible. And, we'll fill in a few stopgaps later on. Now, as the government, you can't just be like, oh, we'll fill in a few stopgaps with something like the IRS. But you get that point, hopefully. So, yeah. But his point was, at least here in the U.S., our resources, they're not infinite, but they're pretty damn staggering. And we act like they're not. And we shouldn't do that. We need to think of the future. We need to think of how we're going to do things in the future and then try to make that way now. Like with power generation. We should be building more solar panels and nuclear power plants and things like this because we're going to need more power, like electricity. Because we're probably going to need to build more desalination plants at some point. Those are very energy intensive. Now we're needing all kinds of power for AI and data centers and things like that. And, we need power to do this. And so we need it quickly, which means we got to look at cutting regulations here and there. So, yeah. So overall, I agree with his message in that we need to look at things differently in this country. We need to examine how things actually do work well in the government and try to copy that in other parts of the government if applicable. But also, be willing to tell other parts you've outlived your usefulness. Time to go. Or be reformed. And it takes will to do that, and there's just none in DC to make that happen. Or it's always it's always one party is for it and the other one's against it. Then after the next election cycle, we've changed sides now, and now it's advantageous for this one that was for it to now be against it. And it's madness. That's why I largely despise both parties. But yeah. So anyway, I would recommend checking the book out if any of that sounded interesting to you. And again, I would also check out the book Smart Towns. I've done a review on it before. If you want like a more in-depth on like the housing issues. And it's a few years old, but it covers other like urban planning things. But very interesting book. Yeah, this one is too. I recommend it. Check it out. There'll be an Amazon affiliate link in the description if you want to buy it that way. If you don't, that's up to you. But yeah, to be clear, in case you don't understand how that works, that doesn't charge you any more money. We get a small cut if you buy it that way. So it's affiliate marketing essentially. It's like a commission. It's not very big on books, but anything helps. So anyway, that's all I've got, folks. Let me know down in the comments what you think. Does this book sound interesting to you at all? Probably be back to fiction after this. I don't know. Haven't decided yet. I did just get a couple of new books recently. I got some BattleTech books. Actually, I have several I still need to read. And also picked up The Running Man by Stephen King because the new movie's coming out. So I'm curious. I want to read the book before the movie comes out so I know how close this one actually goes to source material. Plus, how off the Arnold one was, even though I like the Arnold movie. But yeah. And also another book about a guy making money buying and selling land and stuff like that. Sounded interesting. But anyway, that's all I've got. So, like I said, let me know down in the comments what you think. Like, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. But yeah, other than that, I don't have anything. So I will be seeing you folks at the bookstore if you can still find one.